What would you do if you were in the same circumstances with the characters in the following stories? We would very love to know, and you could share it below under the comment sections. Now, let the stories unfold.
Blood on a hand-knotted Persian rug is notoriously difficult to clean, but when you are scrubbing it for the most ruthless syndicate leader in New York, you don't complain. Cassian Morelli broke grown men with a whisper. Yet, it took two destitute sisters to finally break him. The Southampton estate was less of a home and more of a fortress disguised as a billionaire's coastal retreat. High walls of imported Italian stone hid behind meticulously manicured privacy hedges, while heavily armed contractors from Gavin de Becker and Associates patrolled the perimeter. This was the sanctuary of Cassian Morelli. At 32, Cassian was the undisputed head of the Morelli Syndicate, a family that controlled everything from shipping ports in New Jersey to private banking streams flowing directly into the discreet vaults of Lombard Odier in Geneva. But Cassian was unraveling. A recent, narrow escape from a car bombing in Manhattan had left him with a jagged scar along his ribs and an explosive, uncontainable paranoia. He had fired his entire domestic staff 3 days prior, convinced there was a rat in his inner circle. He threw a crystal decanter at the head of his last butler, simply because the man had poured his espresso a fraction too slowly. Into this suffocating atmosphere of dread walked Clara and Sophie Hayes. They were 23, identical twins, and absolutely desperate. Their late father had left them with a crippling mountain of debt, not from a bank, but from the sort of predatory loan sharks who broke kneecaps before asking for interest. To pay off the $80,000 hanging over their heads, they had signed on with a highly discreet, heavily vetted domestic staffing agency that catered to the ultra-wealthy. The agency paid triple the standard rate for the Morelli estate simply because no one else was willing to risk their life changing the man's bedsheets. Keep your heads down, speak only when spoken to, and whatever you see in this house, you immediately forget, warned Mrs. Gable, the severe, gray-haired head housekeeper who had survived the recent purge purely by remaining utterly invisible. Clara, the quieter, more analytical of the two, nodded, her eyes taking in the security cameras positioned seamlessly in the crown molding of the grand foyer. Sophie, whose empathetic nature often masked a fierce, reckless courage, simply adjusted her starched white apron. They needed this job. Survival depended on it. Their first encounter with the furious boss happened on a torrential Tuesday evening. Thunder rattled the reinforced glass of the estate's windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside Cassian's private study. Sophie was carrying a silver tray with a bottle of San Pellegrino and a single glass, navigating the dimly lit mahogany corridor when she heard the crash. It sounded like heavy oak splintering, followed by a string of vicious curses in rapid-fire Sicilian. Most maids would have turned and run. Sophie paused, her heart hammering against her ribs, but pushed the heavy double doors open. The study was a war zone. A massive custom-built desk was overturned. Financial ledgers, secured satellite phones, and shards of a shattered porcelain lamp littered the floor. Standing in the center of the destruction was Cassian. He was a terrifying sight, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, disheveled hair and eyes as cold and sharp as cracked obsidian. His bespoke Brioni dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a dark, sprawling tattoo of a predatory eagle on his forearm. "I said no interruptions!" Cassian roared, pivoting toward the door. His hand instinctively went to the small of his back, where a matte black Beretta 92 FS rested in a holster. Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't drop the tray. Her sister Clara, who had been dusting the adjacent hallway, stepped into the doorway just behind her, her breath hitching. Clara knew the golden rule, never corner a wounded animal. But Sophie simply stepped over a scattered pile of offshore banking documents, her sensible black shoes crunching on broken porcelain. "You requested water, sir, 40 minutes ago. Your throat must be dry from all the yelling." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara closed her eyes, preparing for the gunshot. The armed guard stationed at the end of the hall tensed. No one spoke to Cassian Morelli like that. No one. Cassian stared at the girl. Her hands weren't trembling. Her chin was tilted up in a quiet, obstinate display of defiance. For a man who lived in a world where everyone either wanted to kill him or kiss the ground he walked on, this mundane, utterly fearless reprimand was like a system shock. The murderous rage slowly drained from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. He looked from Sophie to Clara in the doorway, realizing for the first time that there were two of them. Two identical faces, yet entirely different postures. One a shield, the other a sharp, calculating mind taking in the scattered documents on his floor. "Put the tray down," Cassian commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper, "and clean up this mess. If you misplace a single piece of paper, I'll have you both buried under the Long Island Expressway." As he stormed out of the room, Sophie let out a shaky breath. Clara rushed forward, kneeling beside the scattered documents. "Are you insane?" Clara hissed, her hands shaking as she gathered the papers. "He almost killed you." "He's not a monster, Clara," Sophie whispered, picking up the overturned desk chair. "He's just terrified." Clara glanced down at the paper in her hands. It was a ledger detailing wire transfers. Clara, who had spent years balancing her father's chaotic accounting books, recognized the discrepancy immediately. Millions were bleeding out of Cassian's accounts, hidden through a maze of shell companies. "Soph," Clara murmured, her analytical mind whirring. "I don't think he's just paranoid. Someone on his payroll is actively stealing from him, and I think I know how they're doing it." Within 3 weeks, the Hayes twins became an indispensable, yet silent, fixture in the Morelli household. Cassian, still gripped by a volatile, simmering anger, found himself strangely anchored by their presence. He assigned Clara to exclusively manage his private quarters and study, unknowingly giving a brilliant mathematical mind unrestricted access to his most sensitive operational files. Sophie was assigned to the dining room and personal service, placing her on the front lines of his high-stakes meetings. Clara lived a terrifying double life. Every morning, while polishing the antique bookshelves, she memorized account numbers, routing codes, and offshore corporate structures. She wasn't stealing, she was tracking. The debt collector threatening their lives was a man named Russo, a mid-level enforcer for the Vitiello syndicate, Cassian's fiercest rivals. Clara had connected the dots. The money bleeding from Cassian's accounts was being funneled directly to the Vitiellos. There was a traitor in Cassian's inner circle, orchestrating his financial ruin and supplying the information for the car bombing. She needed concrete proof, hoping she could trade the traitor's identity to Cassian in exchange for their $80,000 debt being erased. The tension peaked on the night Cassian hosted a reconciliation dinner. The dining room, adorned with baccarat crystal chandeliers, seated 6 of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. Among them was Lorenzo Vitiello, the rival boss, and Arthur Penhaligon, Cassian's own trusted underboss and chief financial officer. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken threats. Cassian sat at the head of the table, projecting an aura of lethal calm, though his knuckles were white as he gripped his linen napkin. Sophie stood quietly in the shadows by the oak credenza, a white towel draped over her arm, blending into the wallpaper. Clara was upstairs in the study. She had bypassed the biometric lock on Cassian's secondary safe by lifting his fingerprint from a whiskey tumbler the night before. She was frantically photographing a hidden ledger with a smuggled burner phone when she saw it, Arthur Penhaligon's signature authorizing transfers to a dummy corporation owned by Lorenzo Vitiello. Penhaligon was the rat. Downstairs in the dining room, the main course had been cleared. It was time for a toast. To profitable futures and leaving old grievances buried, Penhaligon declared, his voice smooth and jovial. He gestured to Sophie. "Girl, pour the wine, the good stuff." Sophie stepped forward with a bottle of 1,990 Domaine de la Romane Conti. As she approached Penhaligon to pour, she noticed something that made the blood freeze in her veins. Penhaligon's hand hovered casually over Cassian's empty crystal glass. Between his index and middle finger, a tiny, practically invisible wax capsule was melting from his body heat, preparing to drop a fine, white powder into the rim. Sophie's mind raced. It was ricin, or something equally untraceable. If she yelled, Penhaligon would deny it, and Cassian, a man who required absolute proof, might execute her for the disruption. If she did nothing, Cassian would be dead in 3 hours. She had less than 2 seconds. Instead of pouring the wine, Sophie feigned a trip on the edge of the heavy Persian rug. With calculated precision, she lunged forward. The heavy glass bottle of $20,000 Burgundy slipped from her hands and smashed directly onto the edge of the table, shattering Cassian's crystal glass into 100 pieces and splashing the dark red wine all over Arthur Penhaligon's immaculate Tom Ford tuxedo. The dining room erupted. The guards at the door drew their weapons, the sharp metallic clacks of safeties clicking off, echoing off the walls. Lorenzo Vitiello jumped back, cursing violently. Cassian slammed his hands on the table, standing up so fast his heavy chair crashed to the floor. The vein in his neck pulsed with an ungodly fury. His eyes locked onto Sophie, who was kneeling on the floor amidst the shattered glass and spilled wine, her head bowed in a perfect picture of a terrified, clumsy servant. "You stupid, clumsy bitch!" Penhaligon roared, wiping the wine from his face. "Cassian, I demand you make an example of her right now. Unacceptable." Cassian stepped around the table, his boots crunching on the glass. The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight. He reached down, grabbing Sophie by the upper arm and hauling her roughly to her feet. The pure, unadulterated wrath radiating from him was enough to make the hardened Mafia bosses in the room hold their breath. "Give me one reason," Cassian whispered into Sophie's ear, his tone lethally soft. "Why I shouldn't throw you off the balcony right now." Sophie didn't cower. She leaned in closer, dropping the subservient act, and whispered back, her voice barely a breath against his jaw. "Look at the rim of the broken glass by Penhaligon's left hand. There's white powder mixed with the wine. He was poisoning you." Cassian went entirely still. The furious fire in his eyes instantly turned to ice. He didn't look down immediately. Doing so would tip his hand. Instead, he shoved Sophie backward, violently enough to make it look real, shouting, "Get out of my sight! Go to the kitchens and don't come out until I say so." As Sophie scrambled out of the dining room doors, her heart hammering in her throat, Cassian turned back to the table. He offered apologies to the guests for the incompetent staff, his eyes casually sweeping the wreckage. And there it was, amidst the red puddle. On the base of his shattered goblet, an oily white residue was refusing to dissolve in the alcohol. Upstairs, Clara heard the shouting. She tucked the burner phone into her bra and slipped out of the study, racing toward the servant stairs. She met Sophie in the darkened pantry. Her sister was shaking, her apron stained with expensive wine. "I had to do it, Clara," Sophie whispered, tears finally pricking her eyes. "Penhaligon tried to kill him." Clara grabbed her sister's shoulders. "Penhaligon isn't just an assassin, Soph. He's the one stealing the money. I found the proof in the safe." Before they could formulate a plan to run, the heavy wooden door to the pantry swung open. Cassian stood framed in the doorway, blocking their only exit. His tuxedo jacket was off, and his tie was undone. He held Clara's smuggled burner phone in his right hand. He had pickpocketed it from her apron when she brushed past him in the hallway moments ago. He locked the door behind him with a heavy click. "It seems," Cassian said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble as he stepped toward the twins, "that my maids are much more than they appear to be. The question is, do I shoot you both right now, or do you start talking?" The air in the pantry smelled faintly of dried lavender and imported olive oil, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of adrenaline radiating from the 3 people locked inside. Cassian Morelli stood between the heavy oak door and the Hayes sisters, tossing the black burner phone in his palm. The screen was illuminated, displaying a crisp, undeniable photograph of Arthur Penhaligon's signature on a banque pictée transfer authorization. "You lift a phone from my pocket, bypass a biometric lock that cost me $40,000 to install, and photograph classified syndicate ledgers," Cassian stated, his voice devoid of the rage from the dining room. It was something far more dangerous now, a cold, clinical curiosity. "Then your sister destroys a $20,000 bottle of wine to save my life. I ask again, who sent you?" "Nobody sent us," Clara answered, her voice trembling but her posture unyielding. She stepped slightly in front of Sophie. We applied through the Wellington agency. Background checks, NDAs, the whole 9 yards. We're here because we owe $80,000 to a man named Russo. He works for Vidiello. He threatened to break our legs by the end of the month. Cassian's eyes narrowed. Russo is a bottom feeder, a collector for Lorenzo. You're telling me you risked a bullet to the head from me just to pay off a street-level loan shark? We didn't come here to steal from you, Mr. Morelli, Sophie interjected, stepping out from behind her sister. She met his piercing gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the lethal aura he projected. Clara is a savant with numbers. She balanced our father's chaotic books for years. When you assigned her to clean your study, she saw the discrepancies in your ledgers on the desk. She noticed that the bleeding wasn't random market fluctuation. It was systematic. Clara nodded, gaining confidence as she shifted into her element. Penhaligon isn't just skimming. He's masking the hemorrhage by routing the funds through a Delaware LLC, washing it through a textile import front in New Jersey, and dropping it directly into an offshore account in the Caymans. An account controlled by Lorenzo Vidiello. He's funding his own war against you with your money. Cassian looked down at the phone, swiping through the 3 photos Clara had managed to capture. The math was flawless. The betrayal was absolute. For 2 years, Arthur Penhaligon had been his right hand. The realization that his closest confidant was the architect of the car bombing, the financial drain, and tonight's poisoning attempt settled over Cassian like a shroud of ice. He looked back up at the twins, 2 desperate girls from Queens who had done in 3 weeks what his entire highly paid intelligence network had failed to do. He stepped closer to Sophie. The proximity was suffocating. He could see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat, yet she held her ground. He reached out, his large, calloused hand brushing the wine-stained collar of her apron. The gesture was terrifyingly gentle. "You saw the capsule," Cassian murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "You could have let him drop it. I would be dead. Penhaligon takes over, Vidiello gets my territory, and in the chaos, your debt to Russo disappears. Why save a man you believe is a monster?" Sophie swallowed hard, her empathetic nature cutting through the syndicate politics. "Because I don't think you are a monster. I think you are a man surrounded by vipers, and I don't believe in letting people die just because it's convenient." A heavy silence fell over the cramped pantry. Cassian stared at her, a profound shift occurring behind his dark eyes. The paranoia that had chained him for months finally cracked, replaced by a ruthless, hyper-focused clarity. He had found the rat. But more importantly, in a world built on deception, he had just found 2 women who were completely, unequivocally honest. $80,000, Cassian said quietly, turning his gaze to Clara. "That is your debt?" "Yes," Clara whispered. Cassian slipped the burner phone into his tuxedo pocket. "Consider it paid. But tonight, you 2 no longer work for the Wellington agency. You work directly for me." He turned back to the door, resting his hand on the brass knob. "Penhaligon and Vidiello are sitting at my table, drinking my scotch, thinking I am an ignorant fool. It is time we correct that misconception. Clara, I need you to access my primary terminal upstairs and prepare a wire recall protocol through the SWIFT network. Sophie, you are going back out there with me." Sophie's eyes widened. "To the dining room? They'll kill me." Cassian unholstered the matte black Beretta from the small of his back and checked the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack. "Nobody touches what belongs to me. You are going to serve the dessert. And then, you are going to watch me take my empire back." The atmosphere in the dining room had settled into a tense, uneasy quiet by the time Cassian pushed the double doors open. The shattered glass and spilled burgundy had been hastily swept to the side by the security detail. Lorenzo Vidiello was smoking a thick Cohiba cigar, looking deeply irritated, while Arthur Penhaligon sat with a forced, relaxed posture, dabbing at his ruined Tom Ford jacket with a damp cloth. "My apologies for the theatrics, gentlemen," Cassian said, his voice smooth and commanding as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Good help is notoriously difficult to find these days." Behind him, Sophie wheeled in a mahogany dessert cart, Her hands were shaking imperceptibly, but she kept her eyes down, plating the vanilla bean panna cotta with practiced precision. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she anchored herself to the sheer, terrifying confidence radiating from Cassian. "It's forgotten, Cassian." Penhaligon smiled, though his eyes darted nervously to the fresh glass placed before his boss. "Though I do hope you discipline the girl. Such clumsiness in our line of work can be fatal." "I couldn't agree more, Arthur," Cassian replied softly. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "In fact, fatal mistakes are the only kind that truly matter. Tell me, Lorenzo, how is the textile import business treating you?" Lorenzo paused, the cigar hovering inches from his lips. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I deal in waste management and shipping, Cassian. You know this." "Do you?" Cassian pulled Clara's burner phone from his pocket and tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping perfectly between Lorenzo and Penhaligon. "Because according to the routing numbers my new chief auditor just verified, you have been receiving quite a few shipments of my money through a Delaware shell company, authorized conveniently by the man sitting to your left." Penhaligon's face drained of color. He stared at the illuminated screen showing his signature. The jovial mask slipped, replaced by the cornered panic of a dead man. "Cassian, this is a fabrication," Penhaligon stammered, subtly shifting his weight to access the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "It's a setup. That maid—" "The maid," Cassian interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal, echoing whisper, "just saved me from consuming the ricin you tried to drop in my glass while I was looking away." Chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. Penhaligon lunged out of his chair, drawing a suppressed compact Glock from his shoulder holster. But Cassian was already moving. He didn't flinch. He didn't take cover. With terrifying speed, Cassian drew his Beretta and fired twice. The deafening roar of the gunshots shattered the quiet estate. Penhaligon was thrown backward, crashing into the credenza before sliding lifelessly to the floor. Lorenzo Vitiello's bodyguards reached for their weapons, but before the steel could clear their holsters, the laser sights of Cassian's private security contractors painted their chests. 5 heavily armed men stepped from the shadows of the adjoining hallways, their tactical rifles leveled directly at the rival boss. Sophie had dropped to the floor beside the dessert cart, covering her ears. She felt a strong hand grip her shoulder. Cassian was standing over her, shielding her with his body as he aimed his weapon directly at Lorenzo's forehead. "Call your dogs off, Lorenzo," Cassian commanded, the smoke from the barrel curling into the chandelier lights. "Or you don't leave Southampton alive." Lorenzo raised his hands slowly, chewing on the end of his unlit cigar. He signaled his men to stand down. "You've got balls, Morelli, I'll give you that. But killing Arthur won't get your money back. It's already in the Caymans." Actually, Clara's voice rang out. Everyone turned to the balcony stairs. Clara stood there, holding a silver MacBook Pro. She looked terrified, but her voice was steady. "Actually, Mr. Vitiello, 20 seconds ago I initiated a fraud reclamation protocol through the clearinghouse, citing the documented forgery. Because the funds haven't cleared the 72-hour holding period in your offshore account, the SWIFT network has frozen the assets. It's bouncing back to the Morelli Central Trust as we speak." Lorenzo stared at the quiet girl in the maid's uniform, utter disbelief washing over his weathered face. He looked at Cassian, then at Clara, and finally at Sophie on the floor. "Who the hell are these girls?" Lorenzo muttered. "They," Cassian said, lowering his weapon slightly, "are under my permanent protection. Which brings us to a final piece of business. You have a dog named Russo. He holds an $80,000 marker on the Hayes family. You are going to call him right now, tell him the debt is forgiven, and if he ever breathes in the direction of Queens again, I will personally mail you his head." Lorenzo, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and financially bested by a pair of housekeepers, simply nodded. He reached for his phone. The battle was over. The estate was secured. As the security contractors escorted a furious, defeated Lorenzo Vitiello off the premises and a cleanup crew arrived to deal with Penhaligon, the adrenaline finally began to leave Sophie's system. She sat on the floor, her back against the mahogany wall, staring at the chaotic dining room. Cassian holstered his weapon and walked over to her. He didn't order her up. Instead, the most ruthless syndicate boss in New York crouched down on the Persian rug, ruining his tailored slacks in the spilled wine, just to be at eye level with her. He reached out, gently wiping a streak of dust from her cheek. The coldness in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a burning, intense reverence. "You didn't run," he noted softly. "I told you," Sophie whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. "I don't leave when things get difficult." Cassian's hand moved to the back of her neck, his thumb tracing her jawline. "Then don't. Never leave." He looked up at the balcony, where Clara was closing her laptop. "Your sister is going to run my financial empire, and you, Sophie, you are going to help me run everything else." The Morelli syndicate didn't fall that night. Instead, it evolved. Cassian Morelli learned that true loyalty couldn't be bought with blood money. It had to be earned. Clara took over his offshore portfolios, turning his empire legitimate, while Sophie traded her maid's apron for a permanent place by his side. No one could handle the furious Mafia boss except the twins, who rewrote his entire world.